For the next few minutes, we are going to talk the nuts and bolts about the science of cannabis. Now, I've been doing this work, I've been studying the science of cannabis for nearly 2 decades. And one of the few opinions that I ever tend to hear both opponents of medical cannabis and proponents of medical cannabis agree on is this notion that somehow we don't have enough science. We don't have enough adequate study of cannabis to deem it to be safe and effective by the same standards that we as a society would judge conventional medicines. We hear this claim every day. Hillary Clinton, she wants to be president of the United States. When she launched her campaign in South Carolina and gave a stump speech to the crowd, she led with this notion that the problem with cannabis is that we haven't researched it. And the crowd roared because she promised to allow research into medical cannabis. The DEA, just weeks ago, refused once again to reclassify marijuana. They continued to keep it as a Schedule I controlled substance, a classification that by definition says cannabis possesses no acceptable medical use. The DEA, when making that determination, said that there were no adequate and well-controlled studies assessing the safety and efficacy of marijuana. We hear these statements all of the time, but are they true? Are they accurate? The peer-reviewed clinical literature says absolutely, positively no. All of you out there who are interested in learning and understanding the science surrounding cannabis, you need to go to one particular website. It's not normal.org, it's not mpp.org, it's PubMed. PubMed is the repository for all peer-reviewed scientific data published anywhere in the world. Every peer-reviewed scientific article is available on PubMed. If that article appears in a foreign journal, PubMed translates it into English and you can read those too. So what happens if you and I go to PubMed today and type in the word marijuana? How many peer-reviewed scientific papers are we going to find? Well, the last time I entered the word, I found just under 24,000 scientific papers specific to the cannabis plant and its specific compounds. That is a significant volume of literature. How significant? Well, just type in a few other keywords and you'll very quickly find out. Type in Tylenol. Type that into PubMed. You'll get about 20,000 peer-reviewed studies. That's a lot of papers. That's a lot of literature, but it's not the volume of literature that we have dedicated to cannabis. Type in Tylenol. You won't even find half the number of scientific studies that we have for the cannabis plant. Type in hydrocodone, Vicodin, to many of you out there, one of the most commonly prescribed analgesic substances. We don't even have 1,000 published papers specific to hydrocodone. Adderall is my personal favorite. Who doesn't know somebody who's using Adderall? Look in the scientific literature. See how many reviews and case studies and preclinical studies and scientific peer-reviewed papers are specific to Adderall. It's less than 200. Not even close, not even approximating the volume of literature that we have for cannabis. The reality is that cannabis is among one of the most well-studied and scientifically scrutinized substances known to man. And because it's so well scrutinized, we can answer questions definitively with regard to its safety and efficacy in human use. Now, I can give you this information. I can show you where to find this information. Of course, many of our opponents may be aware of this information too. And they'll be quick to point out, they'll be quick to say, you know, Paul, there may be a lot of scientific information out there about cannabis, but some of that information is talking about potential side effects of the substance. And I'll say, fine, let's have that conversation. Let's talk about the side effect profile of cannabis compared to the side effect profile of conventional medications. There was a study published several years ago in Great Britain. It was reported by MSNBC. Researchers wanted to see just how many adverse side effects were listed on the warning label of conventional therapeutic medicines. And what they found was, on average, a prescription drug listed 70 adverse side effects right on the label. And it was not uncommon to see more than 525 adverse side effects listed right on the label of the drug. Remember, these are adverse effects that occur when the drug is used as prescribed, when the drug is being used properly. All of you out there are well familiar with the side effects associated with very common families of drugs. The opioids, for instance. They can be habit-forming. They can cause overdose death. Acetaminophen, or Tylenol, is toxic to the liver and is associated with about 750 deaths every year in this country. The NSAIDs, your nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen, Motrin, associated with a litany of adverse effects, including damage to the kidneys, risk of heart attack and stroke. The benzodiazepines can interfere with memory. The SSRIs are associated with tremor, suicidal thought. These are commonly prescribed families of drugs, but they have a laundry list of significant adverse side effects. By contrast, cannabis's side effects are relatively subtle. They're relatively nominal. They fall into the category of what we call insignificant side effects. Some of the most common insignificant adverse events associated with cannabis are dry mouth. Another commonly reported side effect is cough, sleepiness. And one of the most interesting side effects that's typically listed in the literature to be associated with cannabis is euphoria. Believe it or not, the actual fact that patients taking the drug report feeling better after taking the drug, well, that's been determined to be an adverse side effect. Apparently, we are in a culture where drugs are only therapeutic, medicines are only considered to be true medicines if they make the patient feel worse and not better. Of course, it can be argued, and critics will in fact argue, that cannabis can be impairing, that it can alter mood. And they'll argue that this is one of the more problematic elements of using cannabis as a medicine. And I always find that to be a very interesting, but not particularly persuasive, criticism. Because if we were to begin removing therapeutics from the pharmacopoeia simply because they altered mood, well, we wouldn't have very many prescription drugs available anymore in our society. The opiates significantly alter mood. Your SSRIs, the entire family of drug exists to alter mood. Same with the benzodiazepines. That's why people take Xanax. That's why they take Valium. They take it to temporarily alter mood. Even common cold medications, antihistamines for instance. Right on the label it will say, do not operate heavy machinery or drive until you've become acclimated to the effects of this substance, because the drug can alter judgment. Acetaminophen, ibuprofen, they actually dull individuals' responses to emotional images. They alter mood. That's what drugs do, and that's what therapeutic drugs do. Cannabis also alters mood. But ultimately, we have to ask the question, what is the problem with elevating a patient's mood? If we have patients who are suffering, who are in pain, and cannabis can alleviate or mitigate that pain, and on top of it, improve their quality of life, make that patient feel better to the point they want to get out of bed that day, how did that become a negative side effect? How did that become problematic? It shouldn't be. It isn't. We're told time and time again that we don't know the long-term effects of cannabis use. I hear this in my own work over and over again. Again, this is a very strange, I would find unpersuasive argument, because we seldom hear questions about the long-term effects of prescription drugs. A great example of this would be Crestor, a drug to lower one's cholesterol. When people go on Crestor, which they tend to do fairly early, midlife, they'll likely never go off Crestor. This is a drug people will be using for 30, 40 years, daily. But you don't hear much criticism. You don't hear many inquiries about what are the long-term effects of Crestor. What are the effects of this drug when someone uses it every day for the next 30 or 40 years of their life? And the reason we don't hear a lot of questions about this is because there is no answer to that question, because no human being has used that particular drug daily for 30 years or 40 years. And that was not a hindrance to bringing that drug to market. The FDA did not say, until this drug is tested in humans for 4 decades, we can't bring it to market, knowing that once we do, humans may actually be using the drug for 4 decades. So why then is this such a concern about cannabis? Particularly when one recognizes that we do have clinical trials involving patients using cannabis for the long term. We have recent data from Israel where patients are allowed, they are permitted to use cannabis as part of a federal program, where we see that patients who use cannabis daily for a period of multiple months to treat their chronic pain can do so safely and effectively and lower their use of opioids while doing it. We have data from Canada, which also has a federal medical marijuana program and has had such a program now for many, many years, where individuals who are suffering from cancer pain and other types of pain were able to use cannabis daily for over a year, and their results were compared to similar patients who were not using cannabis. And what we found was the patients that had the cannabis-based intervention had a better quality of life, they had greater pain mitigation, and they did not suffer any significant adverse health effects due to their cannabis use. Hell, even in the United States, we have an ongoing federal program called the Compassionate Investigational New Drug Program, where the federal government grows marijuana at the University of Mississippi and then ships that marijuana to the Research Triangle Institute in North Carolina, where they roll 300 marijuana cigarettes per month, put them in a can, and ship them out to a limited number of patients who are qualified to use marijuana that they receive from the federal government. These patients arguably are the single heaviest marijuana using cohort in the United States. They are on record smoking 300 marijuana cigarettes daily for several decades. And when scientists assessed their health, their lung function, their circulatory function, their heart attack risk, their cognitive skills, they found no adverse health effects that could be attributable to this daily use of cannabis for several decades. Cannabis that was provided by their own federal government. There was a very important study published some years ago in the Journal of the Canadian Medical Association. It looked at 4 decades worth of clinical trial research involving cannabis-based drugs. Researchers wanted to see how many patients dropped out of the trial. They discontinued the trial because of experiencing significant adverse side effects. 4 decades worth of clinical trials, and researchers couldn't find a single patient who left one of these trials complaining of significant adverse side effects. What they did find was that a handful of patients complained during the time of the trial. They said they were suffering from insignificant adverse side effects, effects like cough and drowsiness and dry mouth, the sort of side effects I talked about earlier. But not one in 4 decades worth of treatment suffered the sort of significant adverse effects that we so commonly associate with conventional medications. The final point I'll say on this is that even though we have some of these long-term trials, controlled trials using cannabis that provide us insight into cannabis's long-term effects, even better, we have reality. We have the real world. Unlike conventional medications, patients have been using cannabis medicinally for thousands of years, giving us a unique perspective into the long-term safety and efficacy of cannabis, a perspective we don't have for most modern pharmaceutical medicines. We're told that there aren't enough clinical trials specific to cannabis. Trials measuring safety and efficacy. The DEA made this statement just weeks ago. Unfortunately, there are, in fact, many clinical trials specific to cannabis that the DEA simply set aside, that they refused to consider, that they deemed to be proof of principle studies as opposed to clinical studies. The most recent review of clinical studies done right here in California under a grant from the state government said that it would be untenable to continue to keep marijuana in Schedule I. Authors said that the safety and efficacy of marijuana is now well established and it needs to be rescheduled accordingly. That's what the scientific data says. The problem has never been a lack of scientific data or a lack of adequate study. The problem is we have a public policy that has been divorced from what the science tells us. And that is what ultimately needs to change. When the FDA reviews the scientific literature regarding the research and development of a new drug, you might think they review hundreds of clinical trials before they give drug approval. You'd be wrong. There was a very interesting study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association a couple of years back. Researchers looked at the years 2005 to 2012, a 7-year period of time, and they wanted to know how many drugs, new drugs, the FDA approved during that time. The answer was 188. But more importantly, researchers asked, how many of these double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trials were performed on these drugs before the FDA said, we have seen enough evidence, we are satisfied, that is adequate study? The answer might surprise you. The average number of drug studies that were performed prior to FDA approval was 2. And in over 1/3 of the new drugs approved, those drugs were approved on the basis of a single clinical trial. That would be 1. We have well over 100 controlled clinical trials assessing the safety and efficacy of cannabis and cannabis-based drugs, utilizing those same models. Again, this isn't about science. If it was, we would already have an entirely different marijuana policy. Unfortunately, this is an issue that was, is, and largely remains one of politics. We're told over and over again that no major medical or health organization supports the use of medical marijuana. That's a hard to believe statement when you think about it. We have 26 states, a majority of the country in Washington, D.C., recognizing the medical use of marijuana by statute. We have tens of thousands of physicians overseeing cannabis therapy, the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of patients. Yet we're supposed to believe that health and medical institutions are not supportive, are not on board with this? Well, the reality is they are. The American Nurses Association, for instance, has resolved in favor of patient access to medical cannabis. The Epilepsy Foundation is on record supporting medical cannabis. The American Public Health Association, an association that has far larger membership than the AMA, is on record supporting medical cannabis. When surveys have been done to ask physicians' opinions on medical cannabis and whether they think it ought to be prescribed, surveys that were done by the New England Journal of Medicine and by WebMD, a majority of physicians say, yes, marijuana is medicine. That is what I believe. Even the AMA is on record supporting the rescheduling of marijuana. And while the AMA has never come out and supported legal access to marijuana, the reality is the AMA consists of only 15% of practicing physicians in America. 85% of doctors don't belong to the AMA. So why ultimately does it really matter what the AMA has to say about this issue? They are a minority organization that is clinging to a fringe position, and they are not representative of the science or the position of the majority of physicians in this country. So to conclude, the reality in America today is we have 26 states and Washington, D.C. that permit the physician-recommended use of medical cannabis. And in many cases, some of these state programs have now been ongoing for almost 2 decades. We have over 1.5 million Americans who are using cannabis safely and effectively under these state programs. At a minimum, we know enough about cannabis and the science of cannabis, as well as the failures of cannabis prohibition, to allow people the option to use a product that is objectively safer than the litany of pharmaceutical, conventional medications that cannabis could and ought to replace.